Three things I'm going to touch on that I spoke about before. Oh, there's somebody coming in. And then I'm going to give you the timeline that I have been working on and developed. And I hope, did anybody read the Genesis account of Jacob this past week? Okay. Oh, it's
You were in
Chad.
Genesis, weren't you?
I
Well, I was looking for it, but it's in, Jacob's in the book of Genesis, right?
Yeah.
That's why I couldn't find, I didn't know exactly where it was, but I'll check it out.
Hi, Chad.
Already showing up without his wife.
He just got married 2 weeks ago. It's
Oh.
great. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over, and I'll just go over it briefly because I'd rather spend the time on the timeline, was what I said about imminency. I'm gonna kind of just read it so I can get through it faster because I go off on rabbit trails. Contrary to common belief, it's possible to know the precise seasons and dates. The biggest stumbling block to this knowledge is the doctrine of imminency, which says that Jesus can come at any time. The short answer to this is he can and he won't, because of his appointed times. As a result of this doctrine of imminency, this any day, any moment doctrine, people have stopped looking for the precise day and hour and season, year of his coming. They prefer to look for signs that he's coming. And the philosophy is the best thing we can do is just keep doing the work he set us to do until he comes. Well, that's all well and good, but it's not really, if you're into prophecy, if you want to know what he's doing and when it's coming and what's going to happen, that's not the right philosophy. There's also a co-doctrine that nothing needs to happen before the rapture, for if we place any event as a precondition for its coming, we destroy imminency. So if you say, well, this has to happen first, well, then there's no imminency. So the Bible clearly teaches that when the church goes, the Antichrist will come. That is, when the restrainer of evil is removed, the lawless one will be revealed. That's 2 Thessalonians 2:7-8. So no sooner is the light switched off, there's going to be darkness. When the light of the world goes, the restraining influence that is in the temple of the Holy Spirit, us, when we're removed, then evil's going to just totally take over. So when the church age ends, the tribulation will begin. There's no chronological vacuum in the timeline of the 70 weeks, and there's no unaccounted time. I'm going to skip over some of this because I want to get to the other thing. Daniel 9:27 and Revelation 6 tells us that the Antichrist is going to bring peace to the Middle East. Though both these scenarios are on the horizon, it's obvious that some things must happen before they arrive. For example, the Bible states that the term of this confirming the covenant peace treaty will be the reconstruction of the third temple on the Temple Mount. And since this can never be part of a negotiated settlement, how will that happen? The reality is that unless there's another major war or wars which will destroy the hegemony and predominant influence of radical Islam and Israel's enemies, there will be no peace between the Arab and the Jew. There will be at least 3 wars that need to be fulfilled before the Antichrist comes, particularly the war of Ezekiel 38. Only then will the temple be rebuilt or built again. But it will be a war prize, not a peace prize. Okay, there's no such thing as imminency in the Bible, and those who believe it simply aren't considering the fundamentals of Bible prophecy, like the 70 weeks and the appointed times. They're just not accounting it in. Okay, and the next thing I want to touch on is what I said about prophecy, God declaring the end from the beginning. The former things of past history are patterns of things to come. Quite simply, God causes history to repeat itself. Isaiah 42 says, "Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them." Isaiah 41 says, "Produce your cause, saith the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. Shew the things that are to come hereafter." So God's telling his people to test him by his own words and the historical fulfillment of prophecy. If God claims to foretell the future, and he does, and states that something will come to pass, and it will, then one need only look at history itself to see if he told the truth. Consider some basic scriptural precepts of understanding concerning Bible prophecy. Ecclesiastes, "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun." Isaiah 46, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me." And the last one, Isaiah 46:10, "Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." So the Lord tells us that we're to remember the things that have happened in the past, for they'll be repeated in a similar manner in the future. Okay, and now I'm going to touch on one little last thing, and I'm going to go over this part first, quickly, because I'll get into this in another session that will give you a lot more detail on it. The sabbatical cycles. Has anybody ever studied the sabbatical cycles, and do you know what they are? Okay, the sabbatical cycles are probably one of the most important things you need to understand before you can really understand how the prophecies are coming down, because everything is tied in to the very beginning, what God established in creation. A sabbatical cycle is 7 years. God's favorite number, 7. Everything is sevens, okay? 7 years following the creation pattern of 7 days. 6 days God created, 6 days man toiled. The 7th day, the Sabbath, God rested. Man is supposed to rest. Now this is an ordinance given to the Jews. They're supposed to still keep this. Even though it's an ordinance to the Jews, it's still an order to Christians in our day, even though none of us do it. I mean, we used to, well, almost.
It's a seal of God. The seventh day is a seal from God. Every king has a seal, and there's a seal there. Just
Right.
read it.
So every 7th year, a cycle of 7 is one sabbatical cycle. The 7th year is the Sabbath year. And every 7th year, the land was, on the Sabbath, the land was to lay fallow. It was to rest. There was no tilling, no planting, no harvesting.
I don't think they do that.
No.
You couldn't go to Tractor Supply and get your fertilizer and pesticide and use the land up like that. This was God's way of preserving the land and making it ready for the next planting. But there's more to it than that. How would people live that year? Or for that matter, the next year, if there was no planting? Because Israel plants in the spring and fall. They were to rely on God, who said he would give them extra grain, which they would store and live off of during that Sabbath year that they weren't to plant or harvest. If they planted in the spring, they would have the harvest in the fall, but then they'd have to plant in the fall to have a harvest in the spring. But God says, don't do that. Let it alone. Leave it. Let the land rest. I'll make sure you have enough food to carry you through. Well, what did that take? Or well, what does this remind you of? What about the manna? that he provided in the wilderness. You take only what you need. If you try to store it, it's going to rot. I'm not going to let you have it. You've got to rely on me. Well, that's what this was. It took obedience and it took faith. Well, they didn't do it. Israel has never followed the Sabbath rest for their land, which is why God sent them to Babylon for 70 years. He gave the land rest for a year for every time they failed to let the land rest. Now, every 7 cycles would culminate, the 49 years, would culminate in a year of Jubilee. In the year of Jubilee, and I'm going over this real fast, this is a lot more detailed, but I just want to give it to you so you'll understand the timeline. All right, in the Jubilee year, what was to happen? God's order was to set everything free. Every 50 years, everything would revert back to the original owner. This was a prophecy for those who could see it and what was going to come at the end of the age when Jesus Christ comes back and establishes the millennial kingdom. Everything is going to go back to the rightful owner of the creation, Jesus. It's the title deed to earth. He's going to take it back. So all these things in the very beginning that God established was all a pattern or a type or a shadow of what was going to come. So if you can understand that, you can understand what's going to happen at the end. So sometimes people sold their land. Sometimes they would sell themselves into like an indentured servant or something to get out of debt or in order to live. But in the Jubilee year, the 50th year, after 7 cycles of 7 sabbatical years, everything would be freed from their debt, their servitude, their land would be returned to the original owner. So once in each person's lifetime, and because this happened every 50 years, they would see a restoration. So based on that, on the sabbatical cycles, if you can keep that in mind, the 7-year plan that God has laid out, I've developed a timeline, and I don't say that it's the gospel. I don't say that I'm absolutely right. This is just something that I have studied probably now for 10 or 12 years. And just slowly as I start, is putting a puzzle piece together until it finally dawned on me what I was looking at. You may not agree with it, that's fine, but I think it's so important because there's so many things in here that shows what's happening today that I can't see. If I'm wrong on some things, it would be details that I don't know because I'm surmising or, just trying to look ahead, but I think you'll see the pattern. Because this is a perfectly in sync pattern in what was the Genesis account in Jacob, following the modern day version of what's being played out right now in front of us. It's a fact that the analogy is almost perfect, right down to the Sabbaths and the sabbatical cycles. It's historic, it happened, it will happen again, and it's happening right now. So, this is the timeline. Jeremiah 30 says, "Alas, for that day is so great that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." The passage above is a prophecy about the nation of Israel, Jacob, because Jacob was renamed, being delivered from their enemies by the second coming of Christ. According to the Bible, in the last days, Jacob, Israel, will experience an unprecedented time of distress and trouble, for all the nations will come against Jerusalem. And that's found in Zechariah and Joel. This time of trouble will escalate during the Great Tribulation, which is the last half or the 3.5 years of the 70th week, and will ultimately conclude at Armageddon, when God's vengeance and wrath will be poured out upon the whole world. The scripture proclaims that Jacob, Israel, will be saved out of that time of trouble by the glorious return of Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. The Bible states that God declares the end from the beginning and causes history to repeat itself in the future patterns and types of former things. I already said Isaiah 46, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times of things that are not yet done. So what's the end and the beginning? In the Bible, what book is at the end?
Revelation.
Revelation. And what book is at the beginning?
Genesis.
Genesis. Since the story of Jacob's life is found in the book of beginnings, Genesis, shouldn't we look there to see if Jacob was once in a great deal of trouble? And if there's a pattern of future events contained in the biblical account of Jacob's time of trouble, can it be seen as having been repeated in history or in the process of fulfillment? So let's begin by looking for the time when Jacob was in trouble. In short, it all began when Jacob struck a deal with a relative of his named Laban. Having fallen in love with Laban's youngest daughter, Rachel, Jacob agreed to serve him 7 years in exchange for her hand in marriage. Those 7 years went by quickly for Jacob, for he labored for a much-beloved prize. Genesis says, and Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had for her. However, once those 7 years were up, Jacob did not get the woman he was promised. Instead of Rachel, he got the older daughter, Leah. For on the night of the wedding party, Jacob consummated the marriage with the wrong woman. Laban, having purposely deceived Jacob, justified his actions by saying it was not customary to give the younger in marriage before the firstborn. I'm going to skip some of the longer scriptures. You can go back and read it. It's in Genesis 29 because I'll run out of time. So Jacob was lied to from the very beginning, as Laban had no intention whatsoever of giving Rachel before Leah. And so the first 7 years for Jacob involved an agreement based on a lie. Keep in mind what these incidences are, because you're going to see an amazing analogy to it. For at the end of the initial 7-year contract, Jacob did not receive what he worked for. I call this the first week of Jacob's trouble, the first 7 years. However, Jacob, still yearning for Rachel, agreed to labor another 7 years for his true love, and thus Laban, realizing that Jacob would indeed serve yet another 7 years, gave Rachel to him in good faith. So we not only got Leah, he immediately also, after Leah had her 1 week bridal honeymoon, he also gave Jacob Rachel. Okay. During this 7 other years of service, Jacob fathers many children who became the tribes of Israel, with Leah and with her maid, her handmaiden. And I'm going to get into all that later, but I just want to lay out the actual timeline first, and then we'll go back, and because there's reasons why and who and all this stuff, but there's just not time for that right now. And he also had son Joseph with Rachel, because Rachel had been barren through these 7 years, almost 7 years, and very jealous of Leah and all this. And that's why she gave her handmaiden to Jacob, and she fathered a son or two. So through the 7 other years, Jacob fathers the children with Leah and Joseph with Rachel. And it's soon after Joseph is born, Jacob informs Laban that he wants to return to his country and find his family a place of their own. But Laban has other ideas. Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thy eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for thy sake. And he said, appoint me thy wages, and I'll give it. And he said unto him, thou knowest I have served thee, and how the cattle was with me, for it was little that which you had before I came, and it's now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord has blessed thee since my coming, and now when I shall provide for my own house also. But Laban said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. So what he did is he decided that he was going to increase the flocks and herds, and he was only going to keep the speckled, and in this way he was working for what? His economy, his inheritance. Keep that in mind. That's another little red flag. So Jacob agrees to stay for an undisclosed amount of time for the hire or wages of cattle and goats. And as time passes, Laban notices Jacob's flocks are thriving while his own grow weaker. As a result, Laban's jealous, holding Jacob in contempt. And Jacob, because of the treatment, decides to flee with his family and cattle. Only thing when he does, Jacob leaves, Laban comes after him. But Rachel had stolen her daddy's images and idols. There's reasons for this, but I can't get into it all now because I'll run out of time, but we'll go back to it. Okay, so Laban said to Jacob, what have you done? You've stolen away. You didn't tell me. And they get into this argument and everything. And finally, Laban says, okay, I'm going to give you my blessing, and you can go. We see from the passages above that Jacob served 14 years for Leah and Rachel. 7 years in the beginning, which he was lied to and didn't get any. He got Leah instead. 7 more years he worked for Rachel. There's 14 years. At the end of this argument with Laban about when he wanted to go, he had already worked 6 years for the cattle and the flocks. So he ultimately labored a total of 20 years in Laban's household. What about the 3 weeks? That's 21 years. Like I said last time, a day is with 1,000. 1,000 years is as a day. A day is with, well, it can also be taken on a yearly basis that way. He was in Laban's household 20 years, and he's leaving. In the 21st year, after completing the 6 years of labor for his cattle, Jacob is now returning to the land of his kindred. He anxiously prepares to encounter his brother Esau on the way, because he knows he's got to go through the country. The last time Jacob saw Esau, Esau was trying to kill him. So there's still trouble ahead for Jacob. So to determine if the way home is safe, Jacob sends out scouts and messengers. And they come back and tell him, well, first he sends them out, okay. And while they're gone to look for where Esau is, Genesis 32 says Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he had prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. In other words, he was a little bit maimed. He wasn't killed or he wasn't injured very badly, but he had a limp afterward to remind him.